Beneath our feet are the former rulers of the earth. In the crust of the earth there are millions upon millions of fossils, and those represent even more millions of species, nearly all of which have disappeared from the face of the earth. But there is one unique species, our own species, which can actually investigate much of that past and perhaps also think of our future. Welcome. Triple welcome. I'm a paleontologist. I work on fossils. And so although I will be talking about the history in our bones, perhaps the first thing to do is to actually look at a few fossils. Now this object here is a lion skull. It's from Africa. It's fierce and dangerous. There are lots of lions in Africa. Here, however, is another lion skull. This one is only 150,000 years old, but it is from Kent. So already we can see that what Kent is like now has changed dramatically from when this animal was running across the ground. Things change in the past. And one of the things we want to understand is how they change. Let me show you an even more dramatic fossil. This lion, as you can see, has got huge teeth, but it is nothing as dramatic as perhaps the most famous of all the fossils. This is, of course, the dinosaur Tyrannosaurus rex. And it's justifiably famous. Look at this lower jaw. This is not a vegetarian of any description. This thing could slice through bone and through gristle and cartilage and make mincemeat of almost anything 80 million years ago. In a later lecture, I will be telling you a little bit more about Tyrannosaurus. And in fact, one thing we can reveal is pretty exactly how fast did Tyrannosaurus rex run? Could you outstrip it, or vice versa? The answer will be in a later lecture. Now, the curious thing about Tyrannosaurus in a way is that although it is one of the most famous of all fossils, there are remarkably few articulated skeletons. There's only really 2 or 3 which are complete. And the person who was responsible for finding 2 of the most fantastic specimens is this man here. This is Barnum Brown. As you can see, he's immaculately dressed for his field work. He always believed in going out proper, shiny black shoes, fur coat. And you might at first think, well, this is a bit of a joke, but it's not, in fact. Barnum Brown, as you can imagine, if he finds Tyrannosaurus rex, was an extremely skilled fossil finder. His boss in New York says, Barnum Brown, he can smell fossils. He had an absolute nose for them. He'd find a piece of bone this long, dig, 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 and the rest of that Tyrannosaurus was revealed. A quite remarkable man. Not every fossil we find is enormous and large. Some are a little bit smaller, but still extremely beautiful. Here we have a lovely fossil fish. It's actually from Lyme Regis. It's a little bit older than the Tyrannosaurus rex. Every scale is in place. Here we have the spines or the fins. Here we have the teeth even, the skull, the rest of the head. Wouldn't it be fantastic to find a fossil like this? Wouldn't it be even better to find an example of Tyrannosaurus rex, or perhaps even go back to Kent if you live there and find a fossil lion, something like that. And you might think these are the best and most exciting of all the fossils you could ever want to find. Well, of course they are in one way. They're magnificent, they're large, and they're dramatic. But in a certain way, they're actually less important than apparently very, very insignificant fossils, such as this small blob here. It doesn't look like very much. It's much, much older than this fossil. And what we're actually looking at is this cigar-shaped structure along here. this particular fossil turns out to be the ancestor of this fish and of Tyrannosaurus rex and even of the cave lion here. And therefore, of course, it's our ancestor. And so in this seemingly insignificant little fossil, we have revealed something which is entirely unexpected, but also shows how we're going to develop on in terms of our evolutionary understanding. And to try and explain that slightly more clearly, what I've asked to have constructed is this rather skeletal-looking diagram here, which we're going to call our tree of life. Now, you can see some familiar objects on it, but first, in the best Christmas tradition, let me decorate it slightly. Us, man, we will place ourselves here. Nothing necessarily special about being at the top of the tree. It's just where it is for today. All of you should be aware that the closest relative to man is, in fact, the chimp and various other monkeys, and also the gorilla here. And notice the way I put the gorilla and the man side by side. And that evolutionary tree is now showing that this branch here, we are very close to one another. Very close indeed, only separated by a few million years. Now we can take this tree and construct more things. Here's something else which is sometimes in the news, a cow. And we put the cow there. And of course we have the familiar cat like that. All of us are mammals, but there are other mammals which are a little bit different from cows and cats and humans and gorillas. And they include such things, for instance, as the kangaroo, which lives in Australia. Similar, but not quite the same. And do you notice the kangaroo is coming down a little bit further? And then if I include other things such as a reptile and then a fish, all of those are branching down here. But what this tree is actually telling us is that all these animals share a common ancestor down here, which in fact was quite similar to that little slug-like object I showed you a moment ago. And you might say, well, how on earth do you know that reptiles and kangaroos are related to humans? Well, it's quite simple. Everybody in this room, thank goodness, has a spine, a backbone, which of course supports them, and so do all of these. The common possession of the backbone means that these things all fall together. Then we can go further down the tree. Here we have the humble worm, and that's an animal, as of course we are. And now we're going very, very deep back into the history of life. And rather surprisingly, the organism which is most similar to the animals is the mushroom. And then we come to the familiar plants, deeper down. And then right deep down, of course, we have the bacteria. And then somewhere down here, of course, we have the origin of life. So in that sense, we can look up through the tree of life, and our fossil record will get better and better and better. And much of what we'll be talking about, of course, will be in this area here. So the first fundamental lesson about the fossil record is it is going to tell you something vital about evolution. That means where you and I come from, and also all the other species which we share this planet with. There is another thing which fossils can also do, which is very, very surprising in a way. What is this object here? This, in fact, is the tooth of a hippopotamus. And it was found in Trafalgar Square. It wasn't left there. It was dug out of the ground. In fact, it's about 150,000 years old. And at that time, London, of course, was not London. It was like the Congo. It was a hot, tropical environment. If we go to other parts of London, we find other sediments which are somewhat younger. And from those we find different sorts of fossils, such as this beautiful great skull here. And this is a rhinoceros. And in particular, it is a woolly rhinoceros. It is one with a very thick coat of fur. It's about 60,000 years old. And at that time, London was no longer like the Congo, hot and tropical. It was like Greenland. There were glaciers up at Birmingham. There was a freezing cold wind through the year. And this creature lived on the edge of the ice cap. And you will remember, I hope, that rhinoceroses are equipped with huge horns. And this, believe it or not, is a fossil rhino horn. You may know that the horn is made of hair, and roughly speaking, it was like that. So you must imagine the rest of the animal stretching out of the room in that direction. Incredible sight. Large, very impressive beast. So that is the second thing we learn about the fossils. They tell us what the ancient world was like. It's not the same as today in all sorts of significant ways. And remember, of course, the world is changing even now, and maybe what we understand in the past we can apply to what's going to be true in the future as well. The fossils really do matter. Right. Now, some of you probably collect fossils, and then presumably most of you have some interest in fossils because of their sheer beauty. And one of the curious things about fossils is that although scientifically they have only been of interest for a couple of hundred years, because that's really when science has got going, fossils have attracted the attentions of humans for thousands of years. And here I think is a rather remarkable example, because this is in fact a necklace made of fossils. We think it's about 4,000 years old. Until very recently, people thought that the Earth itself was about the same age, between 4,000 and 6,000 years old. And the reason they thought that was by and large because there was no reason to think it was any longer, and especially in the West, the biblical chronology was broadly consistent with a very young Earth, if you wanted to read it literally. And this means that when the first scientists started to look at the fossils, such as this one here, which was collected in about 1720, do you see the skull? Here is the backbone. Here are the back legs and the front legs. And here is the book which this man published to describe this very fossil. And as you can see, if I unfold this very carefully, it's a very precious book. There are very few of these in existence. We can see parallel to it exactly the same fossil. And the person who described this fossil, he was a Swiss geologist, said, "Aha, well, it looks like a human. This, I believe, is the remains of a man who was drowned in the great biblical flood." And, of course, there's a sort of slight murmur of amusement. How ludicrous. How could anybody make that mistake? These people were no more stupid than we are. They just had a world picture which was different from ours. They were fitting their information as best they could to the chronology which they understood. This man living today, doubtless, would come to very different conclusions. So one of the things which has turned out to be extraordinarily important is that there has been a transformation in the way in which we understand the depth of time. Earth history has a deep time to it, which now goes into thousands of millions of years. And the man who's responsible for this largely was a rather extraordinary Scotsman known as James Hutton. And although he wasn't in himself madly interested in fossils, it was he and a number of other people who realized that the Earth could not possibly be 6,000 years old or even 10,000 years. It had to be millions, and now we know it's not even hundreds of millions, it's thousands of millions. And this only happened at about the turn of the 18th to the 19th century. Now, the people who started to look at all these wonderful fossils here were often the professionals in Oxford and Cambridge and London. But there were many other people who were as important. And perhaps the most remarkable of all is this lady here. This is Mary Anning. She lived in Lyme Regis, down on the Dorset coast. And as some of you may know, it's an area richly celebrated for its fossils. She was a very extraordinary woman. And in some ways, she was rather like Barnum Brown. She could smell the fossils. She had an unbelievable skill for finding the most important fossils. Finding fossils near Lyme Regis is easy. The sorts of things which Mary Anning discovered were, at that time, little short of a sensation. And we have here one such specimen, which was collected by Mary Anning. It's a huge marine reptile, not the biggest in the world, but even so, startlingly well preserved. If I just show you a few of the main features, what we have here is a skull. Do you see all the teeth along there? Here is the eye socket in this area here. Then we have the backbone going through here. And in addition, we have the paddles, which we use to stabilize the animal. Front paddles, back paddles, and then all the way back down in that area here. Now, although Mary Anning made her living from collecting these sorts of fossils, in one sense, she was still an amateur. And I think if there's one thing I'd like to try and persuade you, more than anything in a way, it is that up to the present day and into the foreseeable future, a great deal of what we're going to understand in terms of fossils and therefore the history of life is going to depend critically on amateurs going out to collect the fossils. They are vitally important to our enterprise. And it's also great fun as well. I mean, that almost goes without saying. Now, all you need then to go out to collect fossils are a few things. The most important thing is a pair of eyes, and in addition, a hammer and a chisel. Now, what we've organised down here, I trust, thank you, Bipin, many thanks, is here I have a block of rock, which in fact has been sent to us very kindly from Lyme Regis. I suspect it will contain some fossils, but what I propose to do is now to split it open. Just one or two words of advice. Sometimes this does not work. This is what is the risk. I've covered this to try and protect anybody from flying chips. Most important, self-evidently, is cover your eyes if you do this thing either with shatterproof spectacles or with proper goggles and the like. Never work with your naked eyes. They are irreplaceable. So we get a hammer and a chisel, and we then begin to apply the most almighty... Oh. Goodness me. Right. Well, actually, that's marvellous, because for lots of reasons. First of all, we have some fossils here, and they have never seen the light of day till literally now. That's sobering in a way. These are things which were alive and now are extinct. They're revealed to us, and what we actually see is a whole set of coiled structures, and some of them have got little crystals. We'll explain that in a moment. And other ones are apparently more or less complete. There's a whole field of these ammonites, and that's the name of these things. These are fossil ammonites, and here they occur in enormous abundance. Well, you may well ask, how on earth did these fossils get here? Well, self-evidently, they died. They sank to the seabed, and then they would have been covered by layers of mud. And at first sight, you might think that these would simply gently rain down to cover the corpses and eventually be preserved in the rock itself. Well, that's certainly sometimes the case, but there are other examples where there is a catastrophic burial. That means that the sediment doesn't come in like snowfall, it begins to cascade in. And one of the most dramatic examples of all, the volcano Vesuvius erupted in AD 79, and those people who did not flee in time were preserved by the hot ash falling on them. Family groups, soldiers, and beggars. All of them were taken as a sort of mould as this terrible infall of ash smothered the entire city, preserving the thing almost as a time capsule. And that's something which the paleontologist, the fossil expert, tries to discover. Well, let's briefly just go back to some sorts of fossils. Breaking open that slab to reveal those particular fossils showed these invertebrates, as we call them, known as ammonites. If I lift this slab here, we now see, in fact, that we have some fossil fish. And when you see these fossil fish, at first sight, it really looks as if some sort of steamroller has gone over them like this. It really does, because they've been completely flattened. You know, there's almost no relief in these things at all. And then if you think about it, well, of course, these things are in the crust of the Earth. They may go down kilometres beneath the surface of the Earth. So at first sight, it's not at all surprising that they are preserved in that sort of way. Well, to try and explain in outline what might have happened in this particular case, I thought we'd organise a fairly elementary demonstration to begin with. What we're going to do is take an example where we're going to apply something suddenly to an unsuspecting object. And thank you, Lydia, here. Here is our test. Science is science. Here is our test specimen here. Three-dimensional, warm and cuddly, but for the greater good of our understanding, I shall now place it just beneath the thing above it. So I'll leave it there on that. I'm not too good at these things, so I might look away for a moment, and perhaps in a moment we will have something to complete this particular demonstration. A large weight. Now, in fact, this is, although is only a demonstration, there is a real message here, because very often the fossil will be buried beneath kilometres of crust, and there will indeed be this vast amount of pressure squeezing the fossil flatter and flatter. And if one goes down perhaps as deep as 15 kilometres, then eventually, when perhaps Celia and I are ready to lift this thing, we may see something very different indeed. Well, that's a simple way of explaining what earth pressure will do to you. But it's not a very scientific experiment, and there are other ways we can analyse the crushing of rocks, which tell us something slightly more important. Thank you very much, Ilya. Thank you. About this. Now, one way one can actually get some quite simple answers quite quickly is to investigate the compression in a more controlled fashion. Now, at this stage, I would actually appreciate the help of one volunteer. It's perhaps it's the chap just on the end of the thing. Would you like to come down and join us for a minute? Thank you. And can you tell me your name first?
Andrew.
Andrew, excellent. The name of my elder son as well, even better. How do you do, Andrew? What I'd like you to do, please, is to begin to twist this, and if I remember correctly, it goes in that direction. Yes, can you carry on twisting this? If you come around a bit here, that's excellent. Thanks a lot. And then we can go as fast as you like if we're going in the right direction. Yes, we are. The sediment here is going to become increasingly compacted. And you might ask, well, how is this going to happen? Well, such things as, for instance, rivers flowing with the sediment onto the surface, perhaps mountain building in particular, heaping up the sediments. Yes, something indeed is beginning to happen to this creature here. It is, of course, being compacted to something which is very much thinner than it was previously. That's good. I think probably we've made our point now. Do you want to just come and look at your handiwork? There we go. As you can see, it's actually compacted itself enormously. May I just thank you, first of all. Thank you, Andrew, very much indeed. But the really important thing is that, in fact, although it's flattened, this fossil's not actually spread out sideways, unlike that poor pretend cat over there. And that's one of the observations that suggests that the way in which the compaction is happening is rather different from simply squashing it with a huge weight. And experiments like this are, in fact, although very elementary, are extraordinarily helpful. Well, not all the fossils which we find are totally flattened like that. Other ones do have some degree of rigidity, and that's why we're going to look at this one now. I think you can all see that it is a bone, and in fact this end of the bone was attached to the rest of the animal. It's only half the bone. It probably stopped around about there, so it's an enormous great thing. Would somebody just like to come down? Maybe the girl there with the stripes on her shirts, yes. Mind your steps as you come. And just before we go any further, if you come to this end, please. Thank you very much. Can you first of all tell me your name and then? Anna. Right, okay. Now, Anna, what you need to do is not touch the bone itself, but just get your fingers underneath the board. I can see that you're on the peak of health, and you're obviously a very strong Anna. Could you just lift this, please? Anna. Oh, Anna. No, you must try harder. Come. Anna is having some trouble. It's extremely heavy. It takes 3 of us to move it. That's lovely. Thanks a lot. Thank you very much. Thanks. The reason, of course, is that this is a fossil bone, and it has been turned basically into rock. No wonder Anna couldn't lift it. It would be beyond any normal person unaided. This thing, in its entirety, would weigh tons. It's an enormous amount of effort to get out of the thing. So what we now have to try and understand is how this sort of particular bone comes to be preserved. To explain that in a little bit more detail, what one needs to first of all know is that the sorts of fossil which you see here were very different when they were alive, because when we look at a modern bone, we find, in fact, that it's very, very porous. It's full of cavities, large cavities and small cavities. And effectively what happens is that these cavities are going to be infilled by some sort of mineral. And that explains the huge weight which we see there. And we have a demonstration to illustrate this example. I want you to imagine that this is a piece of fossil bone. The grey bits are the bone itself, and all these areas are the cavities which I've just referred to here. And I want you to imagine that here we've got a solution of groundwater which is moving through the fossil. And as it does so, something will happen. So what I'm going to do here is just pour some of this material on like this. Imagine the groundwater is flowing quickly through the thing. And we see that very rapidly indeed, often because of the special chemical conditions inside the bone, we actually get a set of crystals forming. And it's those crystals filling in all these particular spaces which lead to what is basically an impossibly heavy object in this area here. All those pores in the bone are being infilled by the various material, due simply to the groundwater crystallizing out. Now, of course, bones, your bones as well, naturally enough, are full of cavities of one sort and another. But they're not the only ones, the only fossils, that is, with cavities which are present. This is a fossil identical to the one which I smashed open a little bit earlier. It's another example of an ammonite. But if we take this ammonite and earlier on have cut it in half, what we reveal within is a whole set of chambers like this. And these chambers here, as you can see, if I move it around like that, it's got a sort of sparkling appearance, okay? Exactly the same as happened with that dinosaur bone. We've got the crystals growing from the groundwater which moved through the fossil to deposit itself as this set of calcite crystals. That's the name of the mineral of which they're composed. So in this example again, we are turning something which was once living into basically a chunk of rock. It therefore enters what we call the geology of the area. Imagine that the minerals we're talking about aren't growing inside the fossil, as they are in a bone or in this ammonite here, but they're growing around the fossil. Imagine the minerals are being precipitated in one way or another. And here is one such example. This thing here we call a nodule. And if we split it open, it reveals a fossil fish. Effectively, what has happened is that the minerals have grown around the fish, encapsulating it, so that here again we have the head and here we have the body extending in this direction here. The whole thing is set effectively into stone. Now, as you can see, these fish are just fantastically well preserved. They're absurd. These ones actually come from Brazil. But we can do even more with this sort of fish. We can actually take tiny pieces out of the fish, and if we put them under the special microscope known as the electron microscope, we see these structures here. These, believe it or not, are actually the fossilized remains of the soft tissue, specifically the muscles, which propelled the fish through the water. Those fibrous structures are the soft tissues which must have been fossilized within a few days. It's absolutely remarkable, quite astonishing. We don't really understand how such a thing happened. So when we're looking at the preservation of those sorts of fossils in nodules, what we thought to do was to try and show this by way of another demonstration. Now then, here we have a fish. And to give you some idea about how it is preserved, what I'm going to do is dip it into two things which we must pretend for today are liquid rock. And I should first of all going to put it in this. And because this rock is nice and liquid like this, I need to freeze it very quickly indeed. Now the freezing process to accelerate it, which has got nothing at all to do with the fossil record, is using liquid nitrogen. And we put it in like that, freeze in that direction, out it goes. Poor fish. Then we put it into a thing like that, and we repeat this process because what I'm trying to demonstrate is how the mineral salts precipitate themselves round the fish in alternate layers. And of course, we then have a fossilization like that. Goodness me. This is science with a fun. And you end up with something which on the outside is really a pretty shapeless object. But we know, of course, that inside it there is a fish lurking. But again, if you're the fossil hunter, you might well find something like that in the field, crack it open, and reveal the fish within. But is it absolutely necessary always to attack everything you find with a hammer and chisel? Do you have to bang everything open? Do you have to hurl things apart to reveal the internal fossils? Sometimes, of course, you do. But there are more subtle ways in which we can approach this particular problem. And by way of an introduction, what we have in here is a mystery object. And we've got to imagine that this is preserved in exactly the same way as the nodules which I just showed you there. Now, a scientific method which is very widely used is to actually find chemicals, weak acids, which can etch away the outside layers and so reveal the internal fish within. Now, this, of course, has to be an incredibly delicate process, so that when I start to do this here, the amount of effervescence, the activity which is going on like this, is very much more rapid than what we would seek to do in the laboratory. But all the time, as you can see, the chemical here is etching into the nodule substance, the white material on the outside, and as it etches in that direction, so in due course, we hope it will reveal exactly what is there. Now, I think that's going to take a minute or two, so I'll leave that just to sort of bob around like that while you can engage in guessing games as to what might be concealed within. Because again, this has a real scientific purpose. What we see in this example here is precisely what paleontologists, the people who study the fossils, use to examine the remains of certain ancient life. Now here I really have to keep my hands incredibly still because we have two of the most fantastic fossils imaginable, which actually come from Australia. They're about 350 roughly million years old. And it just gives you some idea. Let me just pick this up. I have to work with this one terribly slowly. It's a wonderful specimen, because what's happening in that tank there has been done with much more care in this fossil. Here is the remains of the nodule, and can you see the fossil fish preserved within it? Do you see the head here? Every bone is in place, and then the scales of the fish are back like that. And then here, all the scales are loose. Perhaps this end of the fish was beginning to rot away. Do you see the way the scales are much more disturbed, much more difficult to see? And all of this has been revealed by just the same process as we see in this area here. Delicate, very delicate, etching by weak acids. And I put that back, holding my heart still. This other specimen I simply will not pick up. It is much too delicate. But that skull, in fact it comes from a fossil fish, is the same age as this fish. It's from the same deposit. And the whole of that skull has been isolated from this constant etching away of this nodule-like material here. So there, that is almost indistinguishable from some sort of modern preparation. That's the sort of thing which after you've had dinner and eaten a fish perhaps, that's more or less what you see. Yet this is hundreds of millions of years old. If I did pick that up, I won't, the jaws could open, you can see inside its mouth. It's an absolutely startling specimen. Now, I do fear that the rate at which is, oh yes, no, things are coming clear. If I just turn that slowly, I think you can begin to see that yes, indeed, there is, not surprising, yet another fish about to emerge. But we'll leave that to fizz away in its acid bath, and within about 10 minutes or so, that thing will be completely free of its encasing material. A standard technique which is very widely used. So not only do we have these extraordinary fossils, these fish preserved in these nodules, but there are other surprises. And all the time what we're trying to discover is basic facts about life in the distant past. Things to do with evolution, things to do with the environment, and also, especially in this lecture, particularly how these things really did become fossils. Turning into a fossil is not a simple process. It's complicated chemistry, sometimes complicated physics. If we look at a seemingly dull little pebble like this, and we open it up, what we reveal is this most beautiful fossil inside. This is a fossil ammonite. But it's different from the ones we've been looking at so far because it's got this yellowish sheen on it. This yellowish sheen is due to the growth of the mineral parites, and parites is often referred to as fool's gold. And when we see a larger piece of parites such as this, one can see why. So far, I have been looking almost entirely at the fossils which are found in rocks, in shale, often in nodules, sometimes in sandstones, sometimes in limestones. Do all the fossils that we find, do they all occur in sediments? Well, in a certain sense, in as much as most of the crust of the Earth is made of sediments, yes, but there are special and important exceptions to that, which in due course will reveal even more extraordinary things about the past, the history of life. Now, what we have here is a great lump of a yellowish material. It's light, and as some of you may recognize it, it is amber. And perhaps just visible to you it are dark specks within it. They're quite difficult to see, but in fact those specks, if we were to put it under a microscope, would reveal both plant fragments and also insects. Now, what exactly is amber? We love amber for one reason, simply because it forms the most fabulous jewellery. It's a very attractive material to hold. It looks beautiful on people. It's got this warm, rich colour, and nothing wrong with that at all. That's as it should be. But the actual formation of amber is now fairly well understood, at least in outline. In brief, amber is no more than tree resin. If you have a Christmas tree at any time, you may notice bits of gunge, sticky material, oozing out of the bark. That is the same as this material I have in this flask here. Now, some trees produce huge amounts of this resin, and if you imagine on a tree trunk there are many insects or spiders, such as this one here, and sometimes the stuff literally flows out in gallons, and then we can imagine that luckless creatures are buried, not nice, within this resin. It's sticky, it's very viscous. Once the animal is trapped, it's impossible for it to move. It will be overwhelmed by more of the resin flowing down. Then what happens is that, in essence, a sort of polymerization occurs. It turns into a sort of natural plastic, which is the stuff which we actually call amber. And so if we go to look at, I think this is one of the most wonderful specimens of amber I have ever seen. It's absolutely superb. Here we have a clear piece of amber. Inside it, I hope that you can see a spider, and perhaps just visible up there is a harvest man. And if I just move this out very slightly, perhaps it'll be clearer like that. There, encapsulated, 40 million years old, are two of these wonderfully preserved, in fact, they're arthropods. They both belong to the spider group, relatives of the insects. And some of you will know, perhaps from the film Jurassic Park, that people have extracted DNA from the amber, and maybe we can incubate it to form new forms of life from animals which we thought to be extinct, like a dinosaur. Well, in a later lecture, I will actually tell you whether that's on the cards or not. It's turning into a very interesting story indeed. The case of amber, we are dealing with something which was liquid and has turned into a solid. Now, there is something else which is very much in that department. Well, this is extremely cold, and that's perfectly straightforward. It's a huge block of ice. This, of course, is water, which has gone through a phase change, as we say technically, and is now forming this material ice. And we are familiar as humans with its preservative properties, because a good part of the country's food supplies are as deep frozen food. Ice is a marvelous preservative, because the ice keeps the temperature so low that the bacteria are unable to live, or at least they go dormant by and large. Now, of course, we have to keep our freezers on all the time. Already my hands are getting actually pretty cold. We have to keep that freezer on all the time, otherwise, of course, the ice will melt. And it's very difficult, living in this country in particular, to think of parts of the world where such things are not curiosities or have to be kept with advanced technology, huge freezer units, but are an everyday fact of life. But if you were to go to Siberia or to northern Canada, there is a very short summer. The winters are not only very long, they are intensely cold. And most important of all, of course, the ground is frozen solid. The top bit may melt in the summer, but underneath we have this stuff called the permafrost. And that ground never, ever melts. Now, I want you to imagine that in such an area of Siberia, an organism is wandering around, gets into difficulties, falls into a ravine or something, and then becomes deep frozen. What are the sorts of things which we might find? Well, in fact, the story is really rather remarkable. This is another hero of paleontology. This is a man called Fitzenmeyer, and he is not dressed in a fur coat like Barnum Brown because he wants to look smart, and there's nothing wrong with that, but because it's extremely cold. He's in Siberia. He's looking for fossils. Why is he going to Siberia in the middle of the winter? It's because when Fitzenmeyer, and this was about 50 years ago, Siberia was very, very remote, very difficult to get to. The time to travel in Siberia is when the rivers freeze over, and then you can take a sledge, and they are literally drawn by reindeer, and you can travel all over the country searching for new sorts of fossils. So you have to be well protected from the cold. And then the second thing, when we look at the next thing, is here they are on an expedition, and you might say, is this the expedition hut? Are they all nice and warm and cozy inside, despite it being minus 40 outside, minus 40 Celsius? There is a fire in there, but the fire is there for a very different reason, because inside they are having to thaw a fossil animal, which, because the ground is so hard, they have to thaw the ground, saw through it, and then they rush out through that door, put the piece of fossil outside, and it immediately freezes again. And they keep on doing this, and inside, apparently, the smell is absolutely disgusting. And the reason it's smelling revolting will be shown in the final image here, because what they were digging out was a frozen mammoth. And in this particular example, we have the skull of the mammoth in the middle, and on either side, perhaps clearest on this side where I'm speaking, can you see the foot? Those are the soft tissues of a frozen mammoth preserved in the permafrost. And this frozen mammoth is probably about 50,000 years old. So that deep freezer has been running continuously for 50,000 years. Even though it's warm as toast down the equator, here these things do not melt. That's another sort of preservation which is entirely unexpected. Now, it would be unfortunately impossible, perhaps just as well, to bring in a frozen mammoth or even a small part of it, at least in this lecture. But there are bits which we are extremely lucky to have, because these are very, very rare and very, very precious. But this particular specimen is the hair, the fur of a woolly mammoth. It's possible that this is the original coloration of it. And of course it had to have thick fur, because when it lived in Siberia, it was even colder. It was in the grips of a huge ice age. The temperatures plummeted to almost unimaginably low figures, and they had this special protective layer of hair on them. Now, in these frozen mammoths, when Fitzenmeyer and other people have been collecting them, there are also the remains of, in the stomach, its food, and sometimes they're able to open the jaw and see what the last dinner, its last meal was, and there too they would find, in fact, that the mammoths were harmless vegetarians. Well, most of the time. If you hit a mammoth with a pointed stick, as many of our ancestors discovered, they went aggressive. And they weren't the only other animals which could have a nasty turn of temper when they put their mind to it. Because at the same time that the mammoths existed, there were many other mammals. Most of them, not all of them, most of them are now extinct, though many of them only went extinct about 10,000 years ago. And this, perhaps, is the most famous of these. This is the celebrated saber-toothed tiger. It's a giant cat. It's not something you want to meet anywhere, even in broad daylight. It's got these huge stabbing canines. At the front, it's got more teeth to grab you, and then if I turn the skull around slowly, we can see here more teeth which are used to slice through the tissue, through the meat, through the bone. very, very dangerous animal indeed, but as it so happens, extinct. Now, the saber-toothed cats actually have an extraordinarily wide distribution. They roam this country, for instance. But many of the best specimens, many of the most interesting ones, actually come from another part of the world. And this is, in fact, in Los Angeles. And you think, Los Angeles, what's they doing there? Los Angeles is a very wealthy city, and one reason it's so wealthy is because there are huge oil deposits underneath. Some of this oil used to seep up to the surface to form sort of tar pits. And in these tar pits, first things like mammoths and other animals got trapped, and then the saber-tooths moved in, and they got trapped in the same sticky tar, and all of them, in a way similar to the amber, are unable to extract themselves. And here we have the paleontologists working in the La Brea tar pits, extracting the individual bones, and from these tar pits, literally hundreds of thousands of bones, many of saber-toothed cats, have been collected and have been reconstructed. So once again, we have this astonishing glimpse into the past. All the time, although I'm telling you about the way fossils occur, the long-term aim is, why are we using these fossils? How are we understanding that in Los Angeles, saber-toothed tigers are common? Now it's one of the busiest cities in the world. The world changes all the time. So far, I've been showing you bones, 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 bones. And sometimes an ammonite, which is a sort of bone. But skulls and fish and all sorts of things, which we might often refer to as the hard parts, as the hard tissues. But there's another sort of preservation which is in some ways almost as important, and that is to do, especially if you think about the animals in particular. Now, animals are capable of locomotion, they have muscles, and they have nervous systems which instruct them how to move around. And in those particular cases, if one can imagine, for instance, a dinosaur trotting across the ground, or maybe a worm burrowing through the sediment, they will leave behind them traces. And here is one such example of a trace. This is a trace fossil. And if I incline it slightly like that, one I hope can see that we have a burrow along here. And in fact, there's another burrow along there, and there's more disturbed sediment in between. All of this, we think, was made by some sort of, as it so happens, shrimp-like creature. This was basically its home in the seabed. It lived in a burrow. Now, the disadvantage with the trace fossils is that very seldom does the animal conveniently drop dead at the end of its trackway. Most thoughtless, most thoughtless. But there are some rather extraordinary exceptions, and this, I think, is really quite extraordinary. Because what we have here is a slab of limestone from Germany, and we have little footmarks, doing, 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 like that. Here is an animal going for a walk. And then if we follow that trackway around, we find that the trackway is spiralling round and round and round, and oh dear me, at the end there is one dead animal. This is a very confused and unhappy animal. It's known as a horseshoe crab. And what in fact has happened is that this horseshoe crab was caught up in a storm. It was swept into a lagoon, which is very, very poisonous. It sank to the bottom, and the water at the bottom was very, very rich in salt, and it got more and more confused. And in a sense, what we see is its final death march as this animal proceeds towards its final resting place here. So here, unlike this example, we unequivocally know what made that particular trackway. And there's one other curious thing about this particular fossil, and that is that if we look at a living horseshoe crab, and obviously it's not quite the same, it's not squashed, it's not a fossil, but rather strangely, the shape of both the fossil horseshoe crab and the living one are almost identical. There's been hardly any change at all in more than 100 million years between the fossil here on the slab at the end of its death march and the living examples which are found in seas today in many parts of the world. And again, we might want to investigate the reasons for that later on. Now, some trace fossils have a slightly lighter side. This is a piece of a coprolite, but what you would recognize as fossil droppings. It's very hard now, but that's because, again, it's millions of years old. And if we look closely, we can actually see that there are a set of bones running through here. These bones represent this animal's dinner. It swallowed this thing. In fact, these are the remains of an ichthyosaur, which was swallowed by a much larger reptile. This is a baby ichthyosaur, similar to the one which Mary Anning found. So here we have very important information about the diet of this ancient creature like that. So those sorts of trace fossils are giving us an idea about the behavior of ancient life. So what I want you to imagine now is that there are not only perhaps the possibility of animals making traces. You could think, for instance, of a dinosaur trotting across the ground, or a worm burrowing through the seabed. But we want to look much deeper down and perhaps consider other organisms, much more primitive organisms, which could make some sort of trace fossil. And at first sight, one might think that's absolutely daft. What on earth is the possibility of something even as simple as a bacterium, for example, making a trace fossil? Well, in point of fact, it's not daft at all. They do make a very special sort of trace fossil. And this, I hope, will give us the proper introduction. Imagine a seabed. We'll take this as the seabed in shallow water. Now, it turns out that some bacteria actually live on the seabed because they're photosynthetic. That is, they're taking carbon dioxide and water and building their bodies, because that's what photosynthesis is all about. And we have these filamentous bacteria, like these long bits of green material here. So when we imagine them living on the seabed, in this direction, like this. And there they are, happy as a pie. But there is, of course, a danger about living on the seabed. There may be tides or storms which stir up the sediment, and then they are promptly buried, like that. Bye-bye mats, or so you might think. These particular mats of bacteria have a remarkable property of being able to migrate up through the newly deposited sediment, and they re-establish themselves so that they can carry on photosynthesizing. So now the green disk is going to be a layer of bacteria. They're happy again for a short time, but the currents and the tides return, deposit the sediment, they glide up again, they re-establish themselves, back comes the sediment, and then they re-establish themselves again. And I think what you can see quite clearly is that there is a laminated structure here, which is formed by this alternate burial followed by re-establishment. Now, this is not just a hypothetical example. This is not just make-believe. Real fossils are found which show exactly this laminated structure here. And these laminated structures are known as stromatolites. And it's extraordinary that something as tiny as a bacteria, or whole mats of bacteria, can build something which we can see. This stromatolite is more than 1,000 million years old. Now, okay, you might say that's interesting in its own way. Bacteria do things I never dreamt about, but bacteria can tell us other things, not only about being buried to make a stromatolite, but even things about the property of the Earth as a whole. Now, at this stage, I think I will require the assistance of a couple of volunteers. I wonder, could we have some volunteers, please? Let me see. Could I have the boy here with the little thing on his T-shirt, please? Yes. And perhaps the girl, yes, you, the third along, please. Would you like to come down here? And perhaps if you stand there, thank you, and if you join us on the other side. Okay, and if you'd like to come round and stand here. Can you first of all tell me your names? You are Nellie? Spike. Good. Welcome both. Before we do anything, I want you to imagine that we are living on the equator. Now, in our part of the world, we know that in the summer, the sun is high. In the winter, it's low down near the horizon, near the southern horizon. If you've ever lived on the equator, then you will know, in fact, the sun does move across the sky, but because you're on the equator, the sun moves from one hemisphere off to the other hemisphere. And now we have a sun. And Spike, can you start there? And I want you to angle it something like that. Thank you, Bippin. Here is an example of a stromatolite, and notice the laminations here. That stromatolite wants as much light as possible because it is photosynthetic. So it is actually going to grow towards the sun, which at this part of the year is down in the northern hemisphere. The year progresses, and now, Spike, if I can take that from you, the sun is directly overhead. Cue again. And now, of course, the stromatolite wants to grow directly upwards like that. But of course, the year continues to race past, and now when I hand it to Nellie, it's in the opposite hemisphere, and we find that, of course, the stromatolite wants to grow in that direction. It needs as much sunlight as possible. We're now coming towards the end of the year. The sun is directly overhead. Cue. And now we find, of course, that the stromatolite is growing directly towards the sun. And when I return it to Spike for the last one, thank you very much, we now find, of course, that it is growing in that direction. Well, before I explain the significance of this, first of all, can I thank Nellie and Spike very much for your assistance. Thank you very much. Because now I have built a stromatolite, artificial, yes, but there is a real fossil example exactly like this, which grew on the equator 700 million years ago. And that stromatolite shows this sinusoidal pattern. It's a sort of wave-like structure. In this ancient stromatolite, very similar to the fossil example, which I showed you here, we count the laminations which represent a single year, and they are daily. And what figure do we end up with? Well, the prediction, of course, would be 365, because that's the number of days in the year. But in point of fact, when the paleontologists did the count, they found 425. So what on earth does that mean? It means that 700 million years ago, there were 425 days in the year. And of course, there are now 365. So the explanation to that is, if we consider a rotating globe, 700 million years ago, the Earth was spinning much more rapidly. Because as it spun more rapidly, of course, that would mean there were more days in the year. The days themselves were shorter. It wasn't a case that the Earth was zooming around the sun more rapidly. That, as far as we are aware, has not changed at all. And the net result of this, of course, is that if there were 425 days when this stromatolite was being built, now there are 365, therefore the Earth must be slowing down. So the Earth has slowed down, and consequently the Moon has moved further and further away. The Earth in the future will also slow down even more, and the Moon will move even further away from us than it is at the present day. So what we're looking at in the fossil record is much, much more than simply the bones, the dry, dead bones. We're looking at things such as a woolly mammoth, which roamed Siberia 50,000 years ago. We can go back 100 million years ago and follow the death march of that poor horseshoe crab. Or we can even go back 700 million years ago and learn not only about evolution, the history in our bones, but also about fundamental facts like, for instance, the Earth is slowing down. And that, of course, means that we have new possibilities. And one of the next things to do, which I shall speak about in the next lecture, is the way in which we can bring the fossils alive in a real dynamic sense. Thank you. If you would like a booklet or a video pack of all the lectures, which includes a free booklet, please send a cheque payable to BBC Education to BBC Education, P.O. Box 5620, Newbury, RG14 2YA. The booklet is £4.50, the video pack is £29.